lecture of the 2025 spring season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer, Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures and the community. And of course, thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and for hosting them on their YouTube channel, and the State Journal for always giving us some great additional publicity. Since today is the final lecture of the 2025 spring season, we're excited to announce the 2025 fall season starting next month. On Saturday, July 12th at 1 o'clock, we have An American Story, The Red Family Paintings, presented by author and researcher Mac Cox. On August 9th at 1 o'clock, we have George Graham Vest, The Life and Times of Dog's Best Friend, presented by Steve Vest, author and editor of Kentucky Monthly Magazine. Saturday, September 13th at 1 o'clock, we have Thomas Jefferson and the Kentucky Constitution, New Scholarship Demonstrating Jefferson's Influence on the Founding of Kentucky and Its Modern Day Relevance, by Dennis Fleming Jr., author and attorney at law. And on October 11th, we have Odd and Unknown, Frankfort's Unexplainable Phenomena and Academic Approaches to Consider, by Frankfort's own Capital City Museum Director, Eleanor Haskin-Wagner. And on November 8th, we have Dr. Vanessa Holden, who is Associate Professor of History, Director of African American and Africana Studies, and Director of the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative at University of Kentucky, presenting Understanding Slavery in Kentucky. And finally, December 13th at 1 o'clock, we have Home Ain't Always Where the Heart Is, Black Women and Confinement in the Gilded Age, Bluegrass, by Dr. Charlene Fletcher, who is the Francis S. Fessler Assistant Professor of History at Butler University, and she's been studying the Kentucky Penitentiary for the last 10 years with the Kentucky Historical Society. So we're looking very forward to those lectures, and we hope you'll join us. Flyers of the full 2025 fall season can be found in the back. And finally, 2025 has been a year of anniversaries. Last month, we celebrated the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's visit to Frankfort on his historic farewell tour that united a politically divided nation at the time. Next month, we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of Leestown, and I'll want to let you know about our pop-up lecture, which will be Miss Patty Peevler presenting on her new book, Leestown, Where the Buffalo Crossed the River, in honor of the 200th anniversary of the founding of Leestown, which is next month. And today, we have, several months later, after Lafayette's visit in 1825 in May, the event we're talking about today occurred, which was the murder of Colonel Solomon P. Sharp in November of 1825. So this is also a bicentennial event, and our first lecture of the fall season is partly about Matthew Harris Jewett, who painted both Colonel Sharp and the Marquis de Lafayette, and many of you may know that Jewett's portrait of Lafayette hangs currently in the Hall of Representatives at the Old Capitol. And so without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Librarian Diane Dehoney to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us today for this last lecture in our spring season. As John said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. And on behalf of everyone here, we just want to thank you for coming out and spending, which this afternoon, I thought it was going to be raining, but the sun's coming out. So I'm really glad that you chose to join us here today. Thank you so much. It is my great honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Richard Taylor is the author of numerous collections of poetry, 2 historical novels, and several books relating to Kentucky history, including Elkhorn, Evolution of a Kentucky Landscape. A former Kentucky Poet Laureate, he has received 2 creative writing fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as an Al Smith Award from the Kentucky Arts Council. Dr. Taylor received a bachelor's and a Ph.D. in English from the University of Kentucky and a master's in English and a J.D. from the University of Louisville. Practicing law for a few months, he gave up his legal practice, a leave-taking he regards as his gift to the Commonwealth. During grad school, he taught in high schools across Kentucky with the Poetry in Schools program through the Kentucky Arts Council, including editing an anthology of student writing called Cloud Bumping. Embarking on a career in education, he taught at Kentucky State University right here in Frankfort until his retirement in 2008. During that time, he taught in the Governor's School for the Arts, as well as serving as director for the Governor's Scholars Program on 2 campuses. He also spent a year in Denmark as a scholar teacher in the Fulbright program, also teaching a graduate course at Kangwon University in South Korea, as well as short periods teaching abroad in England and Ireland in a study abroad program. Dr. Taylor has received publication awards from the Kentucky Historical Society and the Thomas D. Clark Medallion for his Elkhorn book, as well as receiving a Distinguished Professor Award at Kentucky State. Recently retired from Transylvania University as Keenan visiting writer, he is the co-founder of Poor Richard's Books right here in Frankfort and lives on a farm right outside town. He was also inducted to the Kentucky Writers Hall of Fame in 2023. Please welcome to the podium my friend, Dr. Richard Taylor.
Thanks. You know, our topic today is so convoluted. I think of it as a circus that's really hard to get under one tent. In the early morning hours of November 7th, 1825, Jeroboam Beauchamp fatally stabbed Colonel Solomon P. Sharp at Sharp's imposing home on Madison Street, less than 100 yards from the ruins of Kentucky's second Capitol on Broadway. If you look down St. Clair Street at the third Capitol, the so-called Old Capitol, you would see across, you could imagine in 1825, an additional street, Madison Street. That street was removed in order to create the federal courthouse. The murder sparked national interest, becoming one of the most written about crimes in the nation's 19th century, the O.J. Simpson case of the day. It generated a play by Edgar Allan Poe and a novel by Robert Penn Warren, as well as numerous other literary productions. The murder attracted national attention, as I said. An obscure poet among the productions was an obscure poet named Thomas Holly Chivers, who had attended Transylvania, was first to see the literary possibilities in this story, writing in 1834 a play based on the murder. As I mentioned, Edgar Allan Poe turned his attention to the crime about the same time, beginning but never completing his one serious attempt at drama, Politan, borrowing the form from the tragedies of the Roman playwright Seneca. Neither of these plays was ever performed. Next, an actress named Charlotte Barnes wrote and starred in the first stage production of The Murder. A Canadian writer named John Richardson in 1840 wrote a piece based on the murder titled The Canadian Brothers. Interestingly, Richardson had been a prisoner of war for a time in Frankfort during the War of 1812. Finally, William Gilmore Simms, who was probably the best-known Southern novelist before the Civil War from South Carolina, wrote a romance called Beauchamp in 1842. I'll have a slide of the title page of that book later on. The finest of all the works based on the Kentucky tragedy is Kentucky's own Robert Penn Warren, who wrote a book called World Enough in Time in 1950. And there's a great story about that. His poet and writer, Catherine Ann Porter, came across the 134-page confession in the Library of Congress and shared it with him. And Warren said that it took him 2 hours to read the confession and about 3 or 4 years to write the novel that grew out of it. He also famously said that Kentucky's novels come out of its courthouses. The name of the novel is World Enough in Time. I really recommend it to you. Many critics regard it as his best work, eclipsing even the better-known All the King's Men. If you were to read the news on November 8th, 1825, you would know that Colonel Solomon P. Sharp, a prominent politician, was murdered in his home in Frankfort, stabbed by an assassin. This was a man who some months before had led the delegation that welcomed Lafayette to Frankfort. You would know in a day or two that investigators originally thought the murder was the work of political enemies, Patrick Darby and John V. Waring. But both parties had alibis for the time in question. A few days later, you would know that suspicion finally fell on Jeroboam O. Beauchamp. The O is for Orville. That a posse of 4 went to his farm near Glasgow and persuaded him to return for questioning. In the following months, a grand jury was formed. He was indicted for murder, pleaded his innocence, and was brought to trial on May 8th, 1826. He was tried and found guilty of the murder and sentenced to be hanged. But interestingly enough, his wife, Ann Cook, was permitted to live with him in his cell in the local jail, which was located at the site of what is now the AME church on, I believe that's Clinton Street. And at the time, he was also granted some months a stay of execution or a postponement of the execution so that he could write his so-called confession. Meanwhile, the parties, as the date of the execution grew closer and the governor had turned down his plea for a pardon, the parties agreed to commit suicide together. They attempted first on an overdose of laudanum or opium that she had managed to smuggle into jail. When that failed, succeeding only in making them both wretchedly ill, they used a penknife. They stabbed each other with a penknife that she had managed to smuggle in. She died, but he was well enough to be hanged before a crowd of thousands. Frankfort had a population, I just learned, of about 1,600 to 1,800 in 1825. It's estimated that 5,000 to 6,000 people witnessed his execution. These are the basic facts, but they don't tell what we want to know. The trial and the confession tell us basically what happened, but we don't really know why it happened, at least not entirely. Why did Beauchamp murder Sharp? What involvement did Beauchamp's wife Anna have with Sharp? To what extent did politics play a role in the murder of one of the most prominent politicians in the state, a man who the next day was to be nominated Speaker of the House in the Kentucky General Assembly? Was this an affair of honor or a case of one individual manipulating another to commit a crime? To what extent did this crime reflect human passion and weaknesses inherent in all of us? To what extent did it reflect the cultural customs of the first quarter of the 19th century South? More specifically, to what extent did racial views in Kentucky in the 1820s ignite the tragedy? All the parties in this affair had connections with the Green River country of south central Kentucky, the area around Glasgow, Bowling Green, and Simpson County. The life of Solomon, get this name, Porcius Sharp, 1787, was a classic frontier rags to riches story. Here, incidentally, we'll come back to that, the old Capitol, the Sharp House, but here is a portrait. Matthew Harris's Jewett. Perhaps Jewett was probably Kentucky's most eminent portrait painter before the Civil War. And you can see why. The man could paint a picture. This is the only lifelike image we have of any of the parties to the tragedy. He was born in Washington County, Virginia, the fifth child of Thomas Sharp, a plain, unpretending revolutionary soldier, and Jean Maxwell Sharp, a native of Scotland. In search of land, like so many others, the couple moved to Logan County, Kentucky, in Kentucky's Green River area. Thomas Sharp instilled in his children a desire to rise above their humble origins. Two became physicians, two more renowned lawyers, and another a prosperous merchant. Three were elected to the Kentucky General Assembly. Get these names: Solomon, Leander, and Fidelio. Two of the three daughters married well. One wonders what happened to the third, but Solomon began his career in Bowling Green and rose in the professional ranks through his personality, his legal skills, and enough military experience to justify the honorary title of colonel in the state militia. Tax list, this rags to riches story is kind of interesting. The tax list of 1806 credit the 20-year-old Sharp with only a horse to his name. 2 years later, he owned 3,600 acres of land in 3 counties. In 2 more years, he had title to 7 enslaved persons. By the time of his death, 14 years later, his net worth was over $70,000, making him one of the richest men in the state. A Jeffersonian Republican, he was elected to 3 successive terms in the Kentucky General Assembly. One of his accomplishments, interestingly enough, was anti-dueling legislation, which I suppose every state official still takes, the oath about not fighting or promising to fight in a duel, and that it would have weight, of course, even to the present. At the beginning of the War of 1812, he was elected to the U.S. Congress, just shy of his 25th birthday. He also led troops on an unsuccessful expedition to destroy Peoria and Kickapoo villages north of the Ohio. He apparently was a bit of a poet. When Andrew Jackson defeated British forces at New Orleans, he wrote of the splendors of a patriotic death. If humanity shows to the God of the world a sight for his fatherly eye, I hope I haven't misplaced this. I think I have. It's something about no greater honor can he lie on his flag and die, something like that. What about Jeroboam Beauchamp? Well, the name itself, interestingly enough, and it's not Beauchamp for those of you who majored in French, it actually, his name means pretty field. He was well known by his jailer, John McIntosh, with whom he spent 9 months, because Jeroboam and his wife Anna were in the cell there. And the cell, interestingly enough, was located below the jail and could be entered only through a trap door. Imagine living 9 months under those conditions. Like Anna Cook, Beauchamp spent much of his life cavalierly disregarding what was regarded as proper behavior by the moral guardians of his day. He strived to take on the reckless traits of demonic romanticism. What were those traits? Seeking fame, bookishness, alienated, feeling superior to ordinary people. His family were among the first settlers to the Green River country of Kentucky during the first quarter of the 19th century. Like Sharp's father, Jeroboam's was a middling farmer. That means he was comfortable, but he was not exceedingly wealthy. His land near the Tennessee border was located in what became Simpson County. He married Sally Smithers and raised 7 children. Jeroboam was their 4th child, and we don't really know what Jeroboam looked like. I think you saw that first slide where he is, that was at least one person's idea of what he might have looked like. He was born in 1802. He showed, I don't know how this happens, but he showed signs of intelligence, and his father sent him to study with Dr. Benjamin Thurston, who ran an academy. Kentucky school system public school system had not been established in the 1820s. This was a private academy about 20 miles east of where their farm was located. In the descriptions that come down to us, he was said to be of medium height, had a florid complexion, a turned-up nose, blue eyes, and, quote, a long bush of curly suit of hair, either red or brown. His voice was shrill. His personality was described as eccentric and ungovernable. Accounts paint him as undisciplined and a borderline sociopath. He read law in Bowling Green and was admitted to the bar and had a reputation for being quick and aggressive. Granted his license in 1823 at 21 years of age, he returned to his father's farm and learned of the seduction of Anna Cook, who lived on a farm nearby, appropriately called retirement. She had stepped out of, like very respectable women of the day, she had stepped out of the public view to live in seclusion. Though at first she refused to meet him, he wheedled his way into her company on the pretense of borrowing books from her library. Anna was 17 years older than Jeroboam, 35. Jeroboam and she were married in 1824. And she was known in the neighborhood. She had a reputation of, well, she had a woman of doubtful reputation, whatever that means. Though both read sentimental literature and the epic poems of Lord George Gordon Byron, who wrote, for those of you who remember Survey of English Literature, Don Juan, or Don Juan, I call it, and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. In the Confession, Beauchamp describes her as a worthy female orphan. One of the chief themes of the Romantic literature of the time was seduction. In fact, probably the most famous early American novel was called Charlotte Temple, by the author Susanna Rowson, the most popular novel in early America. Now, the Byronic hero suffers from a haunted melancholy and has a desire for fame. And you can see how these motivations work into the personality of Jeroboam Beauchamp. Before their marriage, Anna shared her secret that Sharp was her seducer. In the confession, he says he went to Frankfort to hunt down Sharp and tells that he promised to kill Sharp under the terms of her consent to marry him. This confrontation and Sharp's refusal to defend himself, according to the confession, gave Jeroboam an excuse to murder him by stealth at night. Most scholars now regard much of the confession as lies. They were to gain the sympathy and justify his assassination of Sharp in a night attack. Eliza Sharp testified that Beauchamp did know Sharp and that he showed no signs of hostility before him. In fact, there are indications that, interestingly, Beauchamp did some legal work for Sharp. And this matter, from the time of the marriage in 1820 to 1824, apparently there was no hostility. There were peaceful relations between the two of them. What about Anna Cook? She was born in Fairfax County, Virginia, sometime during the mid-1780s. She and her family had immigrated to Warren County, Kentucky, between 1805 and 1810, after the death of her father and the breakup of his estate. The census of 1810 shows that her mother was in Warren County by that time, and that they lived on the farm of her brother, John Cook. There are some indications that she resented her lower social station in Kentucky and that she gained a reputation as a loose woman. Excuse me. How they met, as I mentioned, is a little uncertain, though the idea of the meeting borrowing books is probably, sounds very plausible. As for the seduction, she claimed it happened on Sunday, September the 18th, at Sharp's law office. And I think there's some indications that Sharp was doing some legal work for her, relating to the estate of her late father. A child was born of this, their connection, and it was born dead in May or June of 1820. Sharp, for his part, consistently denied being the father. And later, his brother, Dr. Leander Sharp, tried to prove that his brother was, of all places, in church on the day in question. Now, according to the confession, Anna sternly refused to receive society. And Jeroboam, in his courtship, as I said, used this stratagem of the library. In the confession, Beauchamp tells us he told her it had been his firm purpose to take Colonel Sharp's life if he was able to marry Anna Cook. After their marriage, as I mentioned, he went to Frankfort. He challenged Sharp to a duel. He tells us, we don't know this as truth. And Sharp said he could not fight you on account of Miss Cook. I cannot fight you. Beauchamp tells us he drew his dirk, his knife, and bid Sharp to defend himself. Sharp would not fight, saying, "My friend, I can never fight the friend of that worthy injured lady." Beauchamp tells us then he sprang forward and caught Sharp by the breast of his coat and said, "Now, you damned villain, you shall die." Sharp is supposed to have gone on his knees and begged Beauchamp to spare his life. Beauchamp left him, saying that if he met Sharp in the street the next day, he would publicly horsewhip him for refusing to take up his challenge to a duel. Now, there's some indication that Anna Cook used a stratagem to get Beauchamp to marry her. She claimed she was pregnant with their child. And in fact, there was no child ever born of that, growing out of that accusation. Now, it's true that they lived together for some time without resuming the vendetta against Colonel Sharp. And things might have been quietly forgotten, but for one event. In 1825, Sharp resigned his post as Attorney General to become a candidate for the legislature representing what was called the New Court Party at that time. His political enemies revived the old charges of his fathering a child by Anne Cook. Sharp or his supporters countered the charges by claiming that since the child was a mulatto, he could not have been the father. A midwife apparently swore that the baby was discolored. So did the man who made the coffin and buried the baby. Sharp went on to win the election, but Anne and Beauchamp were outraged. Beauchamp felt then that honor would require him to seek revenge. As her husband, after all, it was his duty to protect her. It was probably this charge that provoked Jeroboam to murder Solomon P. Sharp. Now, an interesting question about race and skin color come up here. A 20th century there is a 20th century medical, 21st century medical explanation for the question of skin color. According to an article in the Filson Club Quarterly, the meager evidence indicates that the child was cyanotic. You all know about cyan? Okay. What is often called a blue baby. This would explain the darker skin attested to by the midwife who attended the birth. Anna then became an accomplice in trying to murder Sharp. In the confession, Beauchamp writes that Anna Cook wrote a letter trying to lure Sharp to her farm so he could kill him. Beauchamp wrote that Anna wanted to shoot him herself. But there is evidence to indicate that Sharp and Beauchamp, as I mentioned, had a amicable and professional relationship. Well, what about the murder itself? Jeroboam Beauchamp rode into Frankfort on November 6, 1825, about a half hour after sunset on a moonless night. The hotels were full because the General Assembly was meeting the next day. He finally and ironically found lodging in the home of Joel Scott, who was warden of the penitentiary and an intimate friend of Solomon Sharp. The house was located at the corner of Miro and High Streets. Let's see if I can show you an image of that. That's the house. It's since been, as too many houses in Frankfurt, old houses, has been torn down. Scott reluctantly took him in. Across town, Sharp was politicking, touring the taverns and paying his respects to arriving members of the General Assembly. Back at Joel Scott's, Jeroboam prepared for his mission. He had yarn socks to muffle his footsteps and make sure he left no tracks. He wore an old wool hat and a black silk mask as disguise. In Jeroboam's account, he left Scott's about 9:30 p.m. and found the Sharp mansion, which was located, as we said, just west of the remains of Kentucky's second capital. This is the third capital. This is not a very good photograph of the Sharp house that was located, as I mentioned, on Madison Street. Seeing that Scott was not at home, how he did this, I'm not sure. And then he went to the Mansion House Hotel, which I just learned is at the site of today's McClure Building. And he claims to have seen his victim through the window. He was stalking this guy. After some time, Beauchamp returned to Sharp's house, finding that he hadn't returned. He returned home. Sharp returned home while Beauchamp was lurking around the yard near the house. According to his confession, Jeroboam then waited for 3 hours, hiding in the ruins of the old state capitol, which had burned the year before, and that was before, of course, the building of the third capitol, which stands on the site today. Witnesses during the trial, including the night patrol, said they spotted a man answering Beauchamp's description walking down Sinclair Street between Scott's and Sharp's residence. Sometime after midnight, Beauchamp was lurking outside Sharp's house, a 2.5-story red brick house built flush on the sidewalk on Madison Street. Near 2 o'clock, Beauchamp, masked and armed with a butcher knife, approached the side door in the alleyway between Sharp's house and that of General Samuel South. I think it was, I could be wrong about this, but the Samuel South house, I think, was later the home of Justice John Marshall Harlan, who is regarded as one of the 10 great Supreme Court justices of the United States, and whose house came down in order to construct the federal building on Broadway. He knocked 3 times sharply, awakening Solomon and his wife, Eliza. Eliza, I just learned this from John Walker, who's with us today, that Eliza was from a very prominent family, not related to Joel Scott's, I don't think, Russ, and was in the first Sunday school class west of the mountains conducted by Margaretta Brown, the wife of John Brown, our first senator. And it is said that she learned how to recite, get this, 780 Bible verses. That's quite a feat of memory. Anyway, when Sharp asked who was there, Beauchamp said, John A. Covington, the name of a family that Beauchamp knew were Sharp's friends. Beauchamp begged for him to open the door. Eliza later testified that the voice she heard was shrill and that she would never forget it. Sharp said he did not know him, and Beauchamp asked him to come to the light so he could know him. Beauchamp said he removed the mask when Sharp opened the door, and he grabbed Sharp by the wrist. Sharp reportedly said, "Good God, it's him," and sprang back astonished. He fell to his knees. Beauchamp said, "Die, you villain," and stabbed him actually about 2 inches below his heart in the abdomen. The colonel attempted to throw his arms around Beauchamp's neck and said, "Pray, Mr. Beauchamp," but Beauchamp said he struck Sharp in the face with his left hand and knocked him to the floor. He said in the confession that he saw a light approaching and dashed a little way off, putting his mask back on. He waited in the alley to see if Sharp spoke. His wife spoke to Sharp, but could not elicit an answer. Dr. Leander Sharp arrived at the death scene, but was too late to help. The neighbors, aroused by cries, came in, including George Bibb and Amos Kendall, two of Sharp's associates, finding Eliza in an agony of grief. Eliza had spotted Beauchamp outside the window. Beauchamp said he sank his clothes in the river and dressed in his own street clothes, which he had hid near the river. He buried the murder weapon. He left a shattered family, Eliza and, at that time, her 3 children. Colonel Sharp had been murdered, to make matters even worse, on Eliza's birthday. Beauchamp returned to Scott's house and left early the next morning, sleeping, he said, very soundly. The trial. The trial began May 8th, 1826, nearly 6 months after the murder, and Beach went on trial for his life. Both sides were represented by some of the best legal talent of the day. Beauchamp's attorney was Jon Pope. Incidentally, these are both melodramatic renderings of the murder. You can get an idea, and this is supposedly Anna Cook and Beauchamp. This is Jon Pope, who was the defense attorney for Beauchamp. One of the foremost criminal attorneys in the country and former U.S. Senator from Kentucky. Dr. Leander Sharp testified that he had found Colonel Sharp lying on the dining room floor just inside the door opening to the side yard or alley and drawing his last breaths. Mrs. Eliza Sharp testified that she was present and had seen the assassination. Her most damaging evidence was that she had seen the defendant and heard his sharp, shrill voice at the time of the murder. She had identified him later as the assassin in a voice experiment conducted secretly at the jail. The jury visited the site about 200 yards away and examined the house and the garden and the alley near the house. The floor plan of Sharp's residence was also presented. I don't know how much you can make of that, but it gives you some idea of, you can see the street entrance, and I don't think he entered from the main entrance, but came, as we said, to a side door. Captain John Lowe, a neighbor of Beauchamp in Simpson County, testified that he heard Beauchamp threaten the life of Sharp on more than one occasion. Patrick Darby, I'm getting into too much detail, I'm going to skip some of this. A disbarred lawyer from Tennessee was called. He was an enemy of Sharp and a member of the Anti-Relief Party, and he was suspected of having conspired with Beauchamp in the murder, later proved harmless. Joel Scott testified that that Beauchamp had arrived that night before the opening of the legislature, and his testimony seemed to confirm the previous suspicion of the prisoner's guilt. The prosecution rested its case. The defendant put on its case. The defense put on its case. Witnesses did little to dispel the air of suspicion that hung over Beauchamp. On May 16th, the court reconvened for closing arguments. The defense and prosecution put forth its arguments. The defense arguments were described as ingenious, genuinely eloquent, and sometimes pathetic. After only an hour's deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty and fixed Beauchamp's punishment at death. As the presiding judge was about to pass sentence, defense counsel Pope asked the court to postpone pronouncing sentence until another matter had been resolved. And that was the matter of charging Anna Cook as an accessory. She had been brought to Frankfort she was in Frankfort for an examining trial, and the judge stepped down and another conducted the examination. The examining magistrates, after hearing some witnesses, reported that, quote, all things being considered, they felt disposed to discharge her, unquote. She was released from custody but chose to accompany her husband back to the cell. The confession. After conviction, Beauchamp made a confession. In fact, there were two confessions. The first confession was made to his uncle, Senator, General Assembly, Jeroboam Beauchamp, several hours after being convicted. Many believe that this first confession, made under the stress of the moment and before he could fabricate any lies, was the more accurate. Second was eventually printed in book form, was made after he had lost all hope of pardon and had been in jail just long enough to concoct a final version. And there's a book I wanted to mention. The most interesting book I know on this topic is Murder and Madness, published by the University Press of Kentucky. And it examines the motivations of the parties here. And in effect, Anna Cook and Beauchamp, in his cell, wrote a novel, a piece of fiction, justifying his actions. And it was written very much in the mode of these early seduction novels we referred to earlier, and from the viewpoint of a kind of Byronic hero, kind of aloof and alienated. The second confession was written out during the 6 weeks between sentencing and execution. As historian Winston Coleman interprets it, it was full of distorted and falsified details. Beauchamp put the manuscript into the hands of his uncle, Jeroboam, to have it printed across after the state printer in Frankfort had refused to print it. It was finally published in 1826 with a revision of text and a new title page, which omitted John or Patrick Darby's name. Let's see if that's one of the versions of it. Maybe I don't have an image of that. All right. How reliable is the confession? It's a tissue of lies, highly colored and greatly exaggerated. It's a piece of literature, in effect. Now, let's move on to the reaction of Sharp's family. Leander Sharp wrote his own version of events, wanting to tell the family's side of the story. He gathered affidavits and depositions in the area where Beauchamp and his wife had lived. He published his findings in 1827 at Frankfort in a small paperback book of 140 pages entitled Vindication of the Character. I think this, is that it? No? Maybe I don't have it. Vindication of the Character of the late Colonel Sharp. Dr. Sharp had practiced medicine for 12 years in the Green River country before moving to Frankfort, and he knew Ann Cook. As for the relationship between Beauchamp and Anna Cook, Dr. Sharp found that they had sexual relations for years and that eventually she persuaded him, as I mentioned earlier, to marry her by saying she was pregnant. According to Dr. Sharp, about the time Beauchamp came to Frankfort to take the life of Colonel Sharp as an example to those who sport with female innocence, and as a self-appointed champion of the injured female virtue, he was being sought for having committed the crime himself. There was a warrant for bastardy issued against him in his own county. You see why it's hard to get all of these details to add up to some sort of verifiable truth. The execution. From the time of his sentencing on Monday, May the 22nd, to his execution on July 7th, 3 days after the deaths of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams on the same day in 1826, Beauchamp was under the care of John McIntosh in the Franklin County Jail. Mrs. Beauchamp was permitted to stay in jail with him. The cell could be reached only by means of the trap door I mentioned, where a ladder was drawn and lowered and drawn up. Beauchamp had hoped for a pardon, and this was his reason for implicating the innocent Patrick Darby, whom he at one time claimed as a co-conspirator. On June the 5th, Jeroboam's letter asking for a pardon was transmitted to Governor Deshay. Interesting, there's another wrinkle here. Governor Deshay, as Russ knows, was reluctant to pardon Beauchamp because he had already pardoned his own son for having committed a murder. Now, the parties decided to commit suicide together. They had made the threat. McIntosh had heard them discuss this, the parties discuss this previously, but he didn't take the threats very seriously. Until on July 6th, she appeared to be extremely ill, and the suspicion arose that they had tried to poison themselves. In fact, they had, with the laudanum mentioned, that Anna had smuggled into the cell in her skirts. A guard was placed in the cell to prevent this from happening again. When the governor recommended that the two be separated, Mrs. Beauchamp declared she would not leave her husband unless dragged away by force. Beauchamp confessed that he and his wife entered into a double suicide pact. They took the laudanum. That didn't work. During the rest of the day, Beauchamp had seemed weakened and refused to see the ministers who called. On the day before Beauchamp was to be executed, the governor ordered out 2 companies of the state militia to guard the jail and act as military escorts to the hanging ground. Now, the hanging ground, so far as we know, is located, for those of you who live in Frankfort, right where the old health department used to be on, I guess that's US 60, is that 60 or, yeah, Main Street, the extension of Main Street and Glens Creek Road. Because so many had come to see Beauchamp hang, the site was moved out of town on the Lexington Road, near where, as I mentioned, the health department stands. That evening, the militia began to beat their drums. Beauchamp asked what that meant and came to realize that he would be hanged the next day. Some of the soldiers were placed in the cell that night. During that night, Anna had taken another dose of laudanum. She vomited up the poison that had little effect. They had their last breakfast together. It consisted, for those of us who make note of these things, some chipped beef and a little tea. On the day of the execution, there was a roll of drums at an early hour, and men in uniform mingled with citizens, and an occasional musket was discharged into the air. Reverend Porter Clay, the brother of Henry Clay, accompanied by Reverend Silas M. Knoll, founder of the First Baptist Church here in Frankfort, William Hickman, and George Waller. He wouldn't let them in, but they talked to him through the grate at the top of the cell, finding him to be reconciled in the way which God and his country had assigned him. People came in from other parts of the state all day in stages, by foot, even by steamboat. The gallows had been erected on a hill overlooking the city in a large woodland at the southeast corner of the Lexington and Glen Creek Road. Word came to the crowd about 11:30 that Beauchamp and his wife had stabbed themselves. About an hour before Beauchamp was to be taken out, they had tried to commit suicide again. The guard heard a moan and found the couple lying in their blood. They had stabbed themselves with a small case knife that had been hidden away for just such a purpose. Beauchamp, perfectly composed, told the guard to tell his father that he and his wife are, quote, going straight to heaven. We are dying. Anna had a stab wound to the right of center of her abdomen. Beauchamp stabbed himself in the center of the body, just below the pit of the stomach. The guard alarmed others in the jail, and they came running down to offer assistance. Beauchamp asked them to take out his wife and try to save her life. She was taken to one of the rooms in the jailer's residence, which was behind the jail on Elk Street. Where Elk Street is or was, I don't know. Russ probably does. When asked about what she'd done, Anna said, I struck the fatal blow myself and am dying for my dear husband. Physicians were called in, but they pronounced the wound fatal. Beauchamp himself was led through the prison yard. When he asked to see his wife, he was told she was getting better. When he came to her room, he placed his hand on her forehead and asked if she knew whose hand it was. There was no answer. And he turned to the physicians, saying, Physicians, you have deceived me. She is dying. To the women around the bed, he demanded a tear of sympathy. As he was led away, he kissed her and said, Farewell, child of sorrow. Farewell, child of misfortune and persecution. For you I have lived, for you I died. After saying this over her dead body, he said to the guards that he was ready to go. At 12:30, the two militia companies were drawn up along Clinton Street in the alley where an immense crowd had gathered. There was a cart with his coffin on it, but he was too weak to sit on it. Because he was too weak to sit on it, he was placed in a Dearborn carriage to take him to the gallows. Weak from loss of blood, he was wrapped and placed in the vehicle next to John McIntosh. Just as they were leaving, Beauchamp requested to see Darby. Why, he was asked. To acquit him, Beauchamp said. Apparently he was trying to set the record clean and remove any shadow from Darby's complicity. He then told Darby he wanted to acquit him face to face before he died. He publicly declared him innocent of any participation in the murder of Sharp, but said he was guilty of perjury at the trial. An exchange followed, and Beauchamp waved him off and told the coachman to drive on. There were crowds in the street, and the drums were rolling. He left the jail at the northeast corner of Clinton and Lewis Streets and passed along Ann Street to Montgomery, now Main Street, at Captain Wassiger's Tavern, which is now where the bank is on that corner. Out the Lexington Turnpike to the site of the gallows. The trip was about 0.8 of a mile. As the papers reported, the large, quote, assembly of citizens and strangers had gathered out of curiosity to see that strange, desperate, and eccentric man pay his debt to society and to hear his last words. Along the way, he raised the curtain on the Dearborn to wave at women in the windows. In going up the Lexington Road, Beauchamp spotted one of the jurymen who had condemned him. You rendered a righteous verdict, he said, but on perjured evidence. The juryman asked him who had put him up to killing Sharp. The answer was, "My wife persuaded me to kill him." 5,000 or 6,000 people were gathered at the gallows. He is said to have complimented jailer McIntosh on having built a strong gallows and thanked him for his kindnesses during their weeks together. Weak and groggy, he was lifted out of the Dearborn in his blanket. He requested a drink of water. When someone was fetching it, and here's the bravado that this guy had, he requested the musicians of the 22nd Regiment to play a popular tune of the day called Bonaparte's Retreat from Moscow. He drank the water and told all he was ready. The rope was fit to his neck, and he stood up saying, "Drive off, I am ready to die." The cart started off, and he was, according to the Lexington newspaper, quote, "launched into eternity." The Kentucky Reporter stated that on swinging off, he struggled considerably, but it ceased after 2 minutes. In the space of 10 minutes, all appearances of life had disappeared. The Lexington paper later commented that he met his death with great fortitude and composure. The body was taken down and given to his father, Thomas Beauchamp. That evening, he set off toward Bloomfield, a small village in Nelson County, with both bodies. He was accompanied by his brother, Senator Jeroboam Beauchamp. A large coffin was built at their request to hold both of their bodies. And they were placed in it with his right arm around her neck. They were buried in the local cemetery with a simple funeral. There's the gallows. This is the more recently erected tombstone. I'll show you. This is the original, which they preserved. They were buried in the local cemetery with a simple funeral. At the time of his death, Jeroboam was 23. She was about 40. The stone, now broken in 2 parts, more than 2 parts it looks like to me, reads, "In memory of Jeroboam O. Beauchamp, born September 24th, 1802, and Anna, his wife, born February 7th, 1786, who both left this world July 7th, 1826. Below this inscription is a poem written by Anna Cook. And they had requested that this poem be engraved on their tombstone. And here is, I think, the complete poem. Bear with me, we're nearly to the end. "Entombed below in each other's arms, the husband and the wife repose, safe from life's never-ending storms, and safe from all their cruel foes. A child of evil fate she lived, a villain's wiles her peace had crossed. The husband of her heart revived, the happiness she had long lost. He heard her tale of matchless woe, and burning for revenge he rose, and laid her base seducer low, and struck dismay to virtue's foes. Reader, if honor's generous blood e'er warm thy breast, here drop a tear, and let the sympathetic flood deep in thy mind its traces bear. A father or a mother thou, dishonored see thy sister dear, then turn and see the villain low, and let fall the grateful tear. Daughter of virtue, moist thy tear, this tomb of love and honor claim. For thy defense the husband here laid down in youth his life and fame. His wife disdained a life forlorn, without her heart's loved, honored Lord. Then, reader, hear their fortunes mourn, who for their love their lifeblood poured." The end. That's a lot on one tombstone. Through the perspective of nearly 175 years, The poem seems much too romantic for our taste. Its verse is full of trite expressions. The direct address to the reader, the dramatic overstatement is out of style, yet the poem embodies the themes that have unfailing interest: love and honor, betrayal and revenge, the stuff of which Hamlet is made. It is hard for us to imagine in these sexually liberated times someone so concerned with honor and virtue. Spite and revenge we understand all too well. In this narrative, all the elements seem combined: tragedy, self-sacrifice, soap opera, romantic excess, the grand gesture, killing for honor, and dying for love. Now, on the day of his death, Sharp was scheduled to become Speaker of the Kentucky House of Representatives. Instead, he lay at his home on Madison, which faced the west of the Capitol. On November 8th, it was placed in state in the House of Representatives, which was at that time located at the northeast corner of Market, that's, I guess, Broadway, and Madison Streets, until the funeral. There was an elaborate procession which went from Market to Wilkinson Street to the city limits, which became the Leestown Pike, to the Bellevue Burying Grounds, located 1.5 miles off the Owington Pike in the vicinity of Leestown. Remains later were removed to the Frankfort Cemetery. And there, just a few feet from the grave of Daniel Boone, it's in a beautiful site that overlooks the Kentucky River and the city of Frankfort and the present state capitol. The inscription, interestingly, on the stone, much shorter, reads, "To Father, Solomon P. Sharp was assassinated while extending the hand of hospitality." Thank you. We'll give this to John.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. And if you'll give us a few minutes, we will take questions for about 15 minutes. And let me get that
Sure.
microphone. Is it up here?
Wait, is this it?
Yes. Check, check. There we go. All right. Went off again. Check. Check.
No? You want to?
Check. All right. Does anybody have questions?
Yes.
What were the main differences? What were the main differences in the two confessions that were written? You said the second one was all flowery and full of fake details. And the follow-up question is, do you think this was to engender sympathy and hopes of persuading the governor to pardon him?
Yeah, I think initially it was. That first confession, and this is understandable, occurring 2 or 3 hours after the conviction, and to someone who was close to him, his uncle, he might have been ready to share the truth. And later, after consideration, he began concocting a story. And with all of these elements we talked about later, sort of posing as, there are two different strains here. One is the seeking sympathy for the seduction of Anna Cook. The other is taking on this sort of Byronic pose as someone who's out to right the world, who stands above us all, and it has kind of a superiority complex. I don't know if that answers your question, Brent, but.
Anyone else?
Thanks. How old was Sharp when he died? Because obviously Anna was
Sharp was 38.
38, and she was 43?
And she was 40, and Beauchamp was, did we say 20? 23 or
Okay.
in that neighborhood.
Just wondered
Yeah,
if
he
it
was
was
considered, she was a, I hesitate to use that term here, she was a cougar. Yeah, John.
Oh, what made this so intensely popular across the United States? I mean, obviously, murders were happening in every city across the United States.
It
What
had
made this
so many narrative elements to it. The whole idea of honor, love, seduction, revenge. I mean, you're talking about, as we mentioned, you're talking about great drama. You're talking about Hamlet, for example.
particular publishing company or firm or something that grabbed hold of this and made it that way?
I think it made, I don't know what the newspaper network was like at the time, but the story spread all across the country, and probably at a much slower rate than it would, of course, today. But it had elements that appealed to a lot of people. I'm surprised that no one's made a film of this. You know, it would, because I think it would, it's so excessive in so many ways. The suicide element, drugs, sex, it has it all, you know. Yes, Judge?
The Lafayette came in 1825 to Lexington. Just help me with the chronology here. Was the trial or the murder, how did it?
The murder was I think about 3 or 4 months after Lafayette's visit. And yeah, as I mentioned, Sharp was actually, I read this, was the head of the delegation that welcomed Lafayette. So he was, you know, pretty tall timber, regarded as an important local personality. I don't think John Brown would have been the logical person to do it, or I suppose there was a mayor then. John Brown apparently was not in Frankfort when Lafayette was here, though he visited with Margaretta at Liberty Hall. I think I'm right. Yeah, John?
Well, you mentioned that Sharp was about to be the new speaker. And I know that he was with Governor Deshay, part of the New Court party. But is there any implication of his murder that kind of hurt that New Court party system? Do you know anything about that at all?
Yeah, we were talking a little bit before this our talk today about New Court, Old Court, and I know we have one expert on the Old Court, New Court with us today, and I don't know whether he wants to volunteer a response to that or not, but I don't pretend to be an expert on that. And it was an issue regarding forgiveness of debt, and the Old Court, I believe, wished to enforce the laws. I remember this from law school, the law of replevin. And the New Court, actually, steps were taken. The legislature removed the Old Court. They simply got rid of it. They didn't like the judges. One wonders how applicable that is to today. But they didn't like the judges, and they issued the New Court, and that created a political fission in the political dynamics of the state. And it was apparently pretty bitter. And politics, contrary to what we might imagine, were very bitter in that day. If you think particularly about the national election in 1800 and Jefferson and Adams and others, there was a lot of mudslinging. It was really, really dirty. Yes, Sarah?
This is just an FYI. Margaretta Brown mentions the Beauchamp Sharp in her letters. Oh. I think she was reporting the news to her sister. John might be able to help you out with this. But it's really interesting to read her perceptions of the trial.
And she, of course, was sympathetic with Sharp, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think the son, Mason was friends with the Sharps. There's a connection between the Browns and
all these. Frankfort was a very small town, 1,800 people, and these people were, a lot of them were sort of leaders in the community, and they would have rubbed shoulders. We know they also intermarried quite a lot, and I know a lot of you out there know your genealogies much better than I ever will, and you can point out, well, married cousin Bob, and Bob dated the Brown girls, or whatever,
All right, any more questions? All right, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. My pleasure, John.
And just a reminder, we have the flyers of the new schedule in the back. So thank you all very much. Have a great day.